Hello, welcome to The Conversation in New Central Television. This is the program where we bring you all the political updates and happenings around the continent of Africa. I am Benga Aboroa. Today on The Conversation, we will be analysing French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Africa to build new partnerships. And in Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaoré, the former president, has apologised to Thomas Sankara's family over his murder. But first, we begin in Africa, where we start with French President Emmanuel Macron's three-nation tour of West African states as it seeks to reboot France's post-colonial relationship with the continent. Macron began the tour on Monday, July the 25th, with a visit to Cameroon before moving on to Benin, and will finish the trip in Guinea-Bissau. At the top of the agenda in the talks will be food supply issues, with African nations fearing shortages, especially of grain, due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But security would also loom large as France prepares to complete its pullout from Mali this year. With our countries in the region seeking to head off fears of Islamist insurgency, Macron, who won a new term in April, pledged to keep up his bid for a new relationship between France and Africa. Now, joining us this evening on The Conversation to discuss the French president's trip to Africa is Mbule Nzige Leonard, a political economist and doctoral candidate at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and Asong Michael Kumba, a legal practitioner and a medical doctor. Gentlemen, welcome to The Conversation. Nice to have you both join us.
Thank you very much, Benga.
It's our pleasure, sir.
Yeah. I'd like to start with you, Leonard. It's the first time President Macron will be visiting Cameroon, Republic of Benin, and Guinea-Bissau since becoming president of France in 2017. How significant is this trip by President Emmanuel Macron?
Thank you once more for having me on your show. It's actually quite a big, it's really a big event for the leaders of these three countries, especially for Cameroon and Benin, because now France is the most important political, diplomatic and international support that these respective countries have on the global stage. And we talk about France-Africa relations. They've been, well, with the case of Cameroon, Cameroon has always been very, very much a centerpiece in that Franc-Afrique orbit. That hasn't necessarily been the case with Benin, but then France has traditionally been Benin's largest source of aid. It's also been a source of security assistance, and on the international stage, it's always been there to support Benin in various diplomatic efforts. With respect to Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Bissau is not a Francophone country. However, it is firmly within the Francophone African orbit because it uses the CFA franc as part of the West African Economic and Monetary Union. And at present, the Guinea-Bissau president, Umaro Sissoko, he is the president of ECOWAS. So that also gives him diplomatic leverage to be able to meet with leaders such as Emmanuel Macron.
Thank you, Leonard. I'd like to bring in Michael here. Now, Michael, France and Africa's relationships have been governed by a number of international agreements. And Leonard just mentioned France-Afrique, which we are all familiar with. Have these agreements always delivered the expected results? Because you look at past visits of former French presidents to Africa and, France-Africa summit and all of this grand ideas and meetings that they have. What results have they delivered in the past? And should we be expecting that, something positive will come out of this visit?
Actually, there's nothing positive that can come up from the French president's visit in Africa. We all have to realize and understand that France is losing grounds in its former colonial countries. And what France is trying to do now is to look for means and look for mechanisms to be able to re-establish these relationships which date before even the colonial periods, through the colonial periods, and even after independence. What we have to know is that the agreements between France and Africa don't seem to be those which are in its form legal. That is because when you look at the colonial agreements, we realize that the partnership or the relations which France had with Africa are those related to political, economic, and military agreements. And if we look at it keenly, you look at, if we take, for example, the political agreements which France had with their former colonies, you will realize that they say that their former colonies are supposed to give report of their political activities and also concerning their reserves. They also impose French on these African colonies. Moreover, when we look at the economic conventions or the economic accords which France had with Africa, you realize that they will tell you that they benefit from the principle of preference to all natural resources that are being discovered in their former colonies. For example, if gold is discovered first in a particular French colony, then France has priority in exploiting that mineral resource before any other country.
Sorry to interrupt you, Michael. A lot of these African states, these former French colonies, have had independence for the greater part of, to put it at the conservative estimate, 50 plus years. So why are they still tied to Paris's strings?
That is because actually our independence is on paper, but practically we don't have independence. Because when we go according to the UN Charter, we realize that independence, self-determination, and autonomy is a governing principle to all states. And we realize that the role of the UN Charter is to foster relations between all countries. But in practice, France has not permitted its former colonies to be fully independent. And that is why I was trying to state some of these accords which France had with their former colonies to make us realize that despite all the international principles which are being laid down, those of self-determination, those of autonomy, that gives right to the people to be able to determine their vision, to be able to determine their purposes, and to actually develop their countries, all of these things are still under the table.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I'd like to bring in Leonard here. Now, Leonard, talking about this visit of President Macron, it did raise a few eyebrows among civil society groups. The three countries President Macron will be visiting have all been criticized by activists over their human rights records. The Elysee had insisted that governance and rights issues will be raised. But we do know how sensitive African leaders get when it comes to, colonial influence and interfering in their domestic affairs. So, honestly speaking, will there be any significant changes to the human rights records of these countries following Macron's visit? We do know how repressive the Cameroonian president can be, Paul Biya, who has been in office since 1980. And we also know that opposition leaders in the Republic of Benin have been sent to exit. They've either been exiled or jailed. The famous case of Rekia Madugu is there as a reference. So what do you make of all of this with regards to human rights and the French president's visit?
Well, it's quite interesting with respect to that aspect of his visit, because now we have a scenario where there's growing anti-French sentiment, and one of the accusations leveled against successive French presidencies is that they get involved in African countries' domestic affairs. So now you have a scenario where, on one end, they say, okay, why is France getting involved in our domestic activities or our domestic development? But on the other hand, you have activists saying that why isn't France raising a voice? So France is kind of in a damned if I do, damned if I don't situation. But then with respect to the two countries, especially Benin and Cameroon, during the first term of his office, of his presidential mandate, President Macron regularly criticized President Biya for the imprisonment of opposition leaders, for human rights violations and the wars against and the secessionist conflict in the Anglophone regions, as well as military acts of abuse against civilians in the fight against Boko Haram. Likewise, in Benin, President Macron did not congratulate President Talon when he won re-election unopposed last year. So there have been instances where the French president has spoken about that. That being said, and you have to point to what Dr. Assong spoke about, France is gradually losing influence in what has traditionally been their sphere of influence on the international stage, that is Francophone West and Central Africa. China, Turkey, the Gulf states, Russia as well, in addition to other African countries like Morocco, South Africa, and Nigeria, are gradually gaining different forms of influence in these countries. And all of these countries don't speak to human rights as well as political reform when they want to engage with these respective countries. So Emmanuel Macron has adopted some sort of realpolitik, and he has stuck to issues pertaining to economic cooperation, security assistance. Like, for example, in Cameroon, even though he met with young leaders, he didn't meet with any of the opposition leaders or members of parliament from the opposition parties. And that was something which had initially been expected. The same happened in Benin, wherein he spoke essentially to the growing security threat in the northern regions of Benin. So although President Macron has spoken about, the respect of civil liberties and human rights, it didn't really form a backbone of his current visit.
Thank you, Leonard. I would like to bring back Dr. Assong. Now, what real commitment, still following up on the French president's visit and human rights concerns in some of these countries, what real commitment will the French head of state, Emmanuel Macron, be able to obtain from hosts who are sure to use their meeting on Tuesday as a mark of legitimacy? What are civil society organizations in these countries? What do they make of this?
So actually, I think France is trying to redefine its foreign politics, okay? And we realize that the coming of President Macron to Cameroon and to other French-speaking colonies is aimed at trying to see how they could establish some sort of relationship that is based on the fundamental principles of human rights. That is equality of all nations and equality of people. So I say this because President Macron in his speech said that the relationship between France and Cameroon will have to be one of Gagnant-Gagnant, meaning a win-win relationship. And so by this, I realized that France is changing strategy, and they have realized that they are losing grounds. So they cannot use the all authoritative and dictatorial means which they used before to impose certain things on Africans. So what they are trying to do now is to try to establish a different type of relationship. But the issue here is that this win-win type of relationship, he did not specify the percentages, because we have been having such relationships with France. But the only problem was they had 80% and we found ourselves maybe with 20. So it was important for him to emphasize that this relationship would be a 50-50 type of relationship where everybody will gain equally. Now, concerning the civil society in Cameroon, for me, there is a real problem when President Macron comes to meet the civil society. First of all, we have to understand that the right to self-determination does not belong to a group of people. The right to self-determination belongs to a whole nation. And that right is being exercised by the president and the parliament. And no fraction can claim to have that right over all the others. So when the civil society say that they are going to see President Macron, are they really represented? Do they really represent the population? That is the first question. The second question is, we know very well that most of these organizations which represent the civil society, associations and professional associations which represent the civil society, are all backed by the regime in place. So the question is, can they really put down the issues and the problems of Cameroonians? Which I say no. And it's for that reason that, for me, I really squashed everything that was related to the civil society. Moreover, I believe that it is not in the place of President Macron to teach Africans what to do or to tell the civil society how they are supposed to carry on their activities. Might be to put political pressure. I think Africans are matured enough to be able to take their own proper decisions and be able to self-determine the purposes which they actually desire for themselves. Okay. I've not seen any African president going abroad and seeking to meet the civil society of foreign countries. So why are they doing that in Africa? We have to stop that, and we have to claim our full independence.
Interesting take, Dr. Osonga. I'd like to bring back Leonard. Now, Leonard, President Macron has insisted that France's military presence in the region will adapt rather than disappear once the pullout from Mali is complete. We've seen growing anti-French sentiment, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso. There's a growing militant presence in the north of Benin. As we speak, the French president was in Benin this afternoon. In what ways can France assist the Republic of Benin in dealing with the security threats in the country? Because we see that, you know, these militants are moving away from the Sahel. They're moving towards coastal countries in the Gulf of Guinea. So there's a clear and present danger there. In what ways can France help deal with these security threats?
Yes, indeed. There's definitely a trend over the last year wherein you've had Sahel-based violent extremist groups establishing operations in the northern regions of the coastal West African countries. And the attacks are becoming more and more recurrent, and they're becoming more and more violent as well. And the interesting with respect to France is that, as I said, you know, West and Central Africa has traditionally been its sphere of influence. But then, despite, you know, having a lot of ears on the ground and understanding the dynamics, as well as, you know, how the population has responded to French presence in these regions, France has been more or less tone deaf, especially with respect to its security status in this region. We spoke about the Accord de Défense, the Defense Accords, which has essentially been the backbone, the pillar of post-colonial relations between France and its former colonies, which have been independent for 60 years plus. Nevertheless, France still continues to be the international security guarantor for most of these countries. And irrespective of that, France has not been able to adapt to the desire for a lot of these African countries to carry out or to handle their security affairs on their own, or at least to take the lead. And as we've seen in Central African Republic, they had to reach out to the Russians and say, okay, you know what, we're going to work with the Russians because now the French way of doing things is self-serving, is paternalistic, and is not helping to solve our security situation. So we've seen with the re-election of Macron and with everything that's been going on, especially in Mali, there's a repositioning or repositioning of how France is going to carry out the military strategy, wherein they're moving forces away from Mali. They're going to position them in Niger as well as Cote d'Ivoire. And the new way that they're going to do, France is going to carry out its defense assistance is that it's going to train a lot of Africans. They're going to give them ammunition, they're going to give them weapons, but then it's going to be more African troops on the ground. And there's going to be a scenario where French army is no longer, well, supposedly, they're not going to be in the lead. It's going to be Africans who are going to be leading this fight against violent extremist groups. The only problem is old habits die hard. We've heard that in the past. After the 1994 Rwanda debacle, Jacques Chirac undertook a similar reform, which significantly reduced the number of French troops stationed in Africa. But then with the arrival of Nicolas Sarkozy, and especially during the presidency of Francois Hollande, we really saw an increase or return to interventionist ways of France in the military sense in Africa. So it's going to be a wait and see whether now these promises made by Macron are actually going to materialize and be implemented in the long run.
I guess we just have to wait and see. Dr. Asong, there's a recurring theme in the discourse of most political leaders and even economic decision makers at the national, regional, and continental level. And that issue is the structural transformation of Africa. Like I said earlier, it's been over 50 years since most countries in Africa got their independence. Why is Africa still struggling to transform itself? Can that excuse of, colonialism and neocolonialism, does it still hold water in present-day Africa? Because you see the corruption index, you look at a country like Equatorial Guinea, for example, would you say it's colonial masters that are causing the economic disparity and the high levels of inequality in that country?
So this is my take on the matter. I strongly believe that all the principles which partake to independence and to autonomy are well stipulated by the UN Declarations of Human Rights and the UN Charter. And I strongly believe that the issue here is actually implementing most of these international conventions, which by the complicity of these former colonial masters and our African leaders, we are not able per se to implement fully and completely all these set principles which have been stipulated by international laws. I will take, for example, when we talk about independence, independence governs all aspects of the life of a country. We talk about political independence, we talk about economic independence, we talk about military independence. Now, you will realize that each time there is an election going on in our different African countries, politically, those who are doing their campaigns, they have to go to France. It looks like they are going there to seek approval of the French government. And that is one of the articles which are even stipulated in the former French colonial conventions which they had with their colonies. Moreover, you realize economically that we are still using the France CFA. So France, Colonie Française Africaine, we are still in that air, even though we claim to have independence. And that is because our leaders have not stood firm to actually claim their economic independence. They still hold on to France. When you look at the military independence, we don't have. We still have to be trained by France and have military support from them and to fight terrorism with them. These are all articles or statements which are being provided for in the former colonial agreement. So it therefore means that we have an issue, because when you look at these colonial agreements, they are in contradiction with the very principles of the UN Charter. So we realize that in complicity with our African leaders, the former colonial masters are still finding their way into our countries and making us to all be dependent on them. So that is the first thing. The second thing is that Africans themselves have to claim their independence. Nobody is going to do it for you. It's not President Macron. It's not any foreign president that is going to tell you what to do. It's not Russia that will tell you what to do. It's not China that will tell you what to do. Because as concerning international relations, you have to know that the fundamental principle is self-interest. It's all about self-interest. Russia will not tell you to change because they love you so much. They tell you to change because they know they are going to profit. If you stop trading with France and America, you're going to trade with them and they are going to make a gain. But we have to stop all of that. Africans should not think that they have to seek a different colonial master, because that is what they are doing now. They are seeking Russia as a new colonial master. Africans have to take their destiny into their hands.
Changing one for another.
Know that they are.
Thank you, Dr.
you.
Asong.
So,
Leonard, still following on this theme of, true independence or not, Africa has suffered the blow, the double blow of slavery and colonization. How do we break away from this paternalistic and nanny diplomacy with former with former colonizers and focus on economic emancipation with dignity?
It's a very multi-layered question. That could be a doctoral thesis. Doctoral thesis that probably wouldn't even get finished. But anyway, it's quite interesting because I'm based in South Africa, and those are discussions we have. Thinking about South Africa, we've had actually the triple whammy of slavery, colonialism, and then apartheid. And then obviously neo-apartheid, whereby you have a scenario where political rights are being, the political autonomy has been granted to the majority, but then the minority still has control of the economy. So, they can't be exclusive. And, there's a lot that I agree to what Dr. Asong has said, but then it's quite interesting because now, you speak about the UN charters and all of those agreements. And they speak to liberalism, which is promoting cooperation. And, one can practice or one can promote their self-interest, but at the same time cooperate. Because now, if you're a business person and you want to make profits, obviously you can make the profits by cooperating with another nation or with another business entity. So, there are a lot of concepts which go hand in glove with one another. They can be, they can be achieved mutually. But then speaking to the whole notion of independence, it's quite difficult for a lot of the African countries because now the systems in place, and as we spoke about, for instance, like the UN, for example, the UN was created when most African countries were still colonies or they were dependencies. So in that sense, these institutions which govern, the global political spheres as well as economic and business spheres, they weren't created with our input and they weren't created with the intent of helping us. And despite a lot that has been done to try and rectify it, it has been quite difficult. I'm one who believes that in order for African countries to be able to go forward, they need to cooperate with one another. Because, for instance, you look at the European Union, you look at ASEAN, you look at the North American countries. The reason why they've been able to progress in the way that they've been able to is because they look towards each other initially. And then from there, when they've been able to maximize cooperation with one another, they were able subsequently to, export or be able to not just export goods and services, but also just be able to promote themselves on the global stage. But then on the continent, even at a regional level, I mean, you need a visa. I mean, I have a Cameroonian passport, and you need a visa to go to Equatorial Guinea, even though it's a 15 minutes flight from Douala to the Equatorial Guinean capital of Malabo. Sounds that's bonkers. It's preposterous. So, as I believe as Africans, in order for us to assert our independence, we need to be able to cooperate with one another. I mean, there's so many other facets which can come into play, but then that's the one which comes off the top of my head.
Okay, and we really do need to reflect and cooperate because these issues are still there, and you wonder what the purpose of the African Union is. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Dr. Asong Michael Kumba, and Leonard Mbule Nziga. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both joined me today on The Conversation. We do appreciate your insights and contributions.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
You're watching The Conversation here on News Central Television. We just concluded our conversation on the French president's visit to Cameroon, Republic of Benin, and Guinea-Bissau. We'll now turn our attention to Burkina Faso, where Blaise Compaoré, the former president who was found complicit in the 1987 murder of his predecessor, Captain Thomas Sankara, has apologized to the Sankara family. What's the implication of this and the ramification? Will he be granted a pardon? Who knows? We'll discuss all of this and more when we return from this break.